A wealthy businessman stops to help a small boy on the street, only to discover that the child's most precious possession connects them in a way neither could have imagined. Their lives are about to change forever. In the bustling downtown of a major city, Richard Harrington, a self-made millionaire in his early 40s, was rushing to an important meeting when he nearly collided with a small boy sitting on the sidewalk. The child couldn't have been more than 7 years old, thin and shivering despite the warm spring day, clutching something tightly to his chest. What caught Richard's attention wasn't the boy's tattered clothes or the small cup with a few coins beside him. It was his eyes. There was something hauntingly familiar about those deep brown eyes that made Richard stop in his tracks, forgetting all about his meeting. As the boy looked up, the sunlight caught on a small golden locket dangling from his fingers, and Richard felt an inexplicable urge to know more about this child who seemed so alone in the world. "Are you okay, buddy?" Richard asked, crouching down to the boy's level. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker, Richard in his tailored suit worth thousands and the child in clothes that had clearly been worn for days. The boy clutched the locket tighter, as if afraid Richard might take it. "I'm just waiting for my mom to come back," he said softly, his voice barely audible above the noise of the busy street. Richard nodded, noticing how the boy's knuckles were white from gripping the small golden pendant. "That looks special," he said, pointing to the locket. "Is it yours?" The boy hesitated before slowly opening his palm to reveal a heart-shaped locket, tarnished with age but still beautiful. "A lady at the shelter gave it to me," he explained. "She said it might bring me luck." Richard's heart tightened at the mention of a shelter, and he wondered how long this child had been living without a proper home. "Would you mind if I looked at it?" he asked gently, not wanting to frighten the boy who clearly treasured the small piece of jewelry. After a moment's hesitation, the boy placed the locket in Richard's outstretched hand, watching carefully as if ready to snatch it back at any moment. Richard turned the small golden heart over in his palm, noticing the intricate floral design that covered its surface, a design he recognized instantly. His breath caught in his throat as he felt along the edge for the tiny imperfection he knew would be there, a small dent where it had once been dropped. "This is beautiful," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the thunder of his heartbeat in his ears. "Does it open?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. The boy nodded, showing him the nearly invisible clasp on the side. With slightly trembling fingers, Richard pressed the clasp, and the locket sprung open to reveal 2 photographs. On one side was a much younger version of himself, smiling broadly with his arm around a beautiful woman with long dark hair. On the other side was that same woman holding a newborn baby. Richard stared at the photos, unable to breathe, unable to think. It couldn't be possible. This locket had disappeared 8 years ago, along with his ex-wife Clara and their infant son after a bitter argument that had ended their marriage. He looked from the photos to the boy's face, seeing now what he'd missed before, Clara's chin, his own forehead, a perfect blend of them both. "Where did you say you got this?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper as he studied the boy's face more carefully. The same dark hair as Clara's, the same shaped eyes as his own. Could it really be? The boy looked confused by Richard's sudden intensity. "A lady at the shelter gave it to me when I was little. She said my mom left it for me before she went to heaven." Richard felt the world tilt beneath him as the pieces started to fall into place. Clara had never contacted him after she left, and despite hiring private investigators, he'd never been able to find her or their son. Had she died? Had their child ended up in the foster system without Richard ever knowing? "What's your name?" he asked, his throat tight with emotion. The boy hesitated before answering, "Michael." It was their son's name. Richard felt tears form in his eyes as he realized the truth. He'd just found his long-lost son through a chance encounter on a busy street corner, all because of a golden locket he'd given Clara on their first anniversary. He wanted to embrace the boy immediately, tell him everything, but he knew he needed to proceed carefully. This child had no idea who Richard was, and springing such life-changing news on him could be traumatic. Instead, Richard took a deep breath and tried to speak calmly despite the emotional storm inside him. Michael looked up at the strange man who was now wiping tears from his eyes, confused by the strong reaction to his mother's locket. "Are you okay, mister?" he asked, beginning to regret showing the precious item to a stranger. Richard took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. How could he explain to this child that he believed they were father and son? That the woman in the photo was Michael's mother, who had apparently passed away without ever reuniting them. "I'm just surprised because I recognize that locket," Richard said carefully, not wanting to overwhelm the boy. "The woman in that photo, she was my wife a long time ago." Michael's eyes widened as he looked from Richard to the tiny photograph and back again. "That's my mom," he said quietly. "Miss Jenny at the shelter said she was really pretty and really brave." Richard nodded, his heart breaking at the realization that Clara was truly gone, and their son had been alone all this time. "She was both of those things," he agreed softly. "And the baby in the picture, that's you, Michael." The boy stared at him in disbelief, trying to process this impossible information. "Are you?" he started, unable to finish the question. Richard gathered his courage, knowing this moment would change both their lives forever. "I think I might be your father," he said gently, watching Michael's face for his reaction. The boy's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and something that looked like hope, though he seemed afraid to embrace it. "If you're my dad, why didn't you find me before?" he asked, the simple question cutting through Richard like a knife. How could he explain the complexity of his failed marriage, the desperate searches, the private investigators who had come up empty? "I tried to find you," Richard said truthfully. "I never stopped looking. Your mother and I had problems, and she left with you when you were just a baby. I didn't know where you were, or I would have come for you right away." Michael seemed to consider this, his small face serious as he processed the information. "Miss Jenny said my mom got really sick really fast," he offered quietly. "She couldn't take care of me anymore, so I went to the shelter." Richard nodded, tears threatening again as he imagined Clara alone and ill, unable to reach out to him for help. "I'm so sorry that happened," he said. "If I had known, things would have been different." Michael's fingers traced the edge of the locket, a gesture Richard recognized as something Clara used to do when she was thinking deeply. "How do I know you're really my dad?" the boy asked, his voice small but determined. It was a fair question, one that showed wisdom beyond his years. Richard smiled sadly, appreciating his son's caution after what must have been years of disappointment. "We can take a test that will prove it," Richard explained. "It's called a DNA test, and it can tell us for sure if we're related. But even without that, I recognize that locket because I gave it to your mother on our first anniversary. See this tiny dent on the back? That happened when she dropped it while we were on vacation in Hawaii. And if you look very closely at the hinge, you'll see our initials, R and C, engraved in tiny letters." Michael turned the locket over, examining it closely before looking up with wide eyes. "I see them," he whispered, a new understanding dawning on his face as he realized this stranger might truly be his father. Richard wanted nothing more than to embrace his son, but he knew he needed to proceed carefully. This boy had likely faced too many broken promises and disappointments in his young life. "Michael, I know this is a lot to take in," he said gently. "And I understand if you're scared or confused. But I want you to know that finding you is the most amazing thing that's ever happened to me." He paused, watching as Michael's fingers closed protectively around the locket again. "What would you think about coming with me to get something to eat? We could talk more, and you could ask me anything you want to know." "I am kind of hungry," Michael admitted, his voice small but with a hint of hope. Richard smiled, offering his hand to help the boy up from the sidewalk. Michael hesitated only briefly before taking it, his small fingers warm against Richard's palm. As they walked toward a nearby diner, Richard felt a storm of emotions. Joy at finding his son alive, grief for Clara, anger at the years they'd lost, and a fierce determination that Michael would never want for anything again. The boy walked beside him, still clutching the locket that had miraculously brought them together. "You know," Richard said softly, "your mother loved you very much. She used to sing to you every night before you went to sleep." Michael looked up in surprise. "What did she sing?" he asked eagerly, hungry for any detail about the mother he couldn't remember. Richard smiled, the memory bittersweet. "It was a French lullaby her grandmother taught her. She believed it would give you sweet dreams." He hummed a few bars of the tune, watching as Michael listened intently, as if trying to recall a memory just beyond his reach. "Sometimes I dream about someone singing," the boy admitted quietly. "I can never see her face, but the voice is nice." Richard felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even though Clara was gone, pieces of her remained in their son, in his eyes, in his thoughtful nature, and perhaps even in his subconscious memories. The diner was warm and inviting, with red vinyl booths and the comforting smell of coffee and pancakes. Richard guided Michael to a quiet corner where they could talk privately. The waitress raised an eyebrow at the odd pair, a well-dressed businessman and a clearly underprivileged child, but said nothing as she handed the menus. "You can order anything you want," Richard told Michael, who was staring at the menu with wide eyes. "Anything?" the boy asked in disbelief. "Even a chocolate milkshake?" Richard nodded, smiling at such a simple wish. "Absolutely. And pancakes or waffles or whatever else looks good." As Michael happily studied the menu, Richard discreetly sent a text message to his assistant, canceling all his appointments for the day and asking her to find the best family lawyer in the city. There would be paperwork, DNA tests, and likely custody proceedings to navigate, but Richard was prepared to move mountains to make this right. He watched his son, deliberating between chocolate chip pancakes and a waffle sundae, and he made a silent promise to Clara that he would give Michael all the love and security she would have wanted for him. As their eyes met across the table, Richard saw a tentative smile form on Michael's face, the first real smile the boy had offered him. It was small and hesitant, but it contained a universe of possibility. After they ordered chocolate chip pancakes, a waffle sundae, and a chocolate milkshake for Michael, who couldn't choose just one, the boy seemed to relax a little. "Do you live in a big house?" he asked, his curiosity about Richard beginning to emerge. Richard smiled, thinking of his penthouse apartment that had always felt too large and empty. "I do have a pretty big place," he admitted, "with a spare bedroom that would be perfect for you, if you'd like that." Michael's eyes widened. "My own room?" The concept seemed almost beyond his imagination. "Absolutely," Richard affirmed. "And we can decorate it however you want." Michael considered this for a moment before asking more tentatively, "Would I still have to go to the shelter sometimes?" The question broke Richard's heart. "No, buddy," he said gently. "If the tests show what I already know, that you're my son, then you'll live with me all the time. No more shelter, ever." Michael nodded slowly, processing this information while fidgeting with the locket. "And what if the test says you're not my dad?" he asked, his voice small and vulnerable. Richard reached across the table, cautiously placing his hand over Michael's. "Then I'll still make sure you're taken care of," he promised. "But I'm pretty sure that locket is telling us the truth." Their food arrived, momentarily distracting Michael from the life-changing conversation. Richard watched in amusement as the boy's eyes grew wide at the sight of the enormous breakfast spread before him. "This is the best day ever," Michael declared before diving into his pancakes with enthusiasm. Richard smiled, but his mind was racing ahead, planning next steps. They would need to visit the shelter, speak with this Miss Jenny, arrange for a DNA test, and begin the legal process of establishing his paternity. There would be challenges ahead, explaining Michael's sudden appearance to friends and colleagues, helping his son adjust to a completely different lifestyle, addressing the emotional trauma the boy had surely experienced. But watching Michael enjoy what was probably his first restaurant meal in a long time, Richard knew with absolute certainty that finding his son was worth any challenge that might come their way. The golden locket that had seemed like such a painful reminder of his failed marriage had become something else entirely, a miraculous connection that had led his son back to him when he'd least expected it. As Michael looked up from his pancakes with chocolate smeared across his chin, Richard felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly took his breath away. This was his child, his flesh and blood, the missing piece he hadn't even known was absent from his life until this very moment. After breakfast, they walked to the shelter where Michael had been staying intermittently. It was a clean but clearly underfunded facility, with peeling paint and mismatched furniture. Miss Jenny turned out to be a kind-eyed woman in her 60s who greeted Michael with genuine affection before regarding Richard with cautious suspicion. "Michael says you might be his father," she said directly once they were seated in her small office. Richard explained about the locket, about Clara, and about their separation years ago. Miss Jenny listened intently, occasionally glancing at Michael, who was playing with some toys in the corner of the office. "Clara came to us about 4 years ago," she finally said. "She was already very ill, cancer, and knew she didn't have much time. She told me she'd made mistakes, that she'd let pride keep her from reaching out to Michael's father." Richard closed his eyes briefly, imagining Clara sick and alone, too stubborn or perhaps too ashamed to contact him. "She left that locket for him," Miss Jenny continued. "Said it was the most valuable thing she owned, Not in money but in memories. She hoped someday it might help Michael find his way back to his father. Richard looked over at his son, who was carefully constructing a tower of blocks while still keeping one hand protectively on the locket around his neck. "I want to make this right," he told Miss Jenny. "I want to give him the life Clara would have wanted for him, the life he deserves." The older woman studied him carefully, clearly weighing her responsibility to protect Michael against the possibility of reuniting a family. "We'll need to do this properly," she finally said. "There will be paperwork, background checks, home visits." Richard nodded eagerly. "Anything," he agreed. "I'll do whatever it takes." Miss Jenny smiled then, the first real smile she'd offered him. You know, when Clara talked about Michael's father, there was still love in her voice, despite everything. "I think she would be happy about this." Richard felt tears threaten again, thinking of all the wasted years, all the misunderstandings that had kept them apart. "I never stopped loving her," he admitted quietly. "Even after everything, there was always a part of me waiting for them to come home." Miss Jenny patted his hand gently. "Well then," she said, "let's see about making a new home for her son." As they spoke, Richard noticed Michael watching them from across the room, his eyes full of hope but also fear, the uncertainty of a child who had learned not to trust good fortune. Richard gave him a reassuring smile, trying to convey without words that everything was going to be okay. For the first time, he truly believed it himself. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. The DNA test confirmed what Richard had known in his heart from the moment he saw the locket. Michael was indeed his son. With the help of a skilled family lawyer and Miss Jenny's advocacy, the legal process moved forward remarkably quickly. Richard's penthouse apartment underwent a transformation as one of the spare bedrooms became a paradise for a 7-year-old boy, complete with bunk beds. Even though there was only one of him, Michael had expressed wonder at the concept. A desk for future homework, bookshelves filled with age-appropriate adventures, and walls painted a cheerful blue that Michael had selected himself from dozens of color samples. Through it all, Michael remained somewhat cautious, as if afraid to believe fully in this dramatic change of fortune. He kept the locket with him constantly, often opening it to look at the pictures inside, the mother he barely remembered and the father he was just getting to know. Richard understood the boy's hesitation. Trust would take time to build after years of uncertainty and disappointment. But each day brought small victories. Michael's first genuine laugh during a pillow fight, his wonderment at the view from the penthouse windows, his shy request for a good-night hug that evolved into a bedtime ritual. Richard treasured each step forward, patient with the occasional setbacks when Michael would grow quiet and distant, overwhelmed by the changes in his life. On the day the adoption was finalized, a formality to legally establish Richard's paternity, they stood together outside the courthouse, both dressed in new suits that matched. "So it's official now?" Michael asked, looking up at Richard with those familiar eyes. Richard nodded, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. "It's official. You're stuck with me now, buddy." A small smile played at the corners of Michael's mouth. "And you're stuck with me," he replied, his voice gaining confidence. Richard laughed. "That's the best deal I've ever made." They began walking toward the car where Richard's driver waited, Michael's small hand hesitantly finding its way into Richard's larger one. "Dad." The word, spoken for the first time, nearly stopped Richard's heart. "Yes, son," he managed to respond, his voice thick with emotion. Michael touched the locket around his neck. "Do you think Mom can see us? Do you think she knows we found each other?" Richard looked down at his son, at this miracle he'd never expected to find. "I know she does," he said softly. "And I think she helped make it happen." As they drove away from the courthouse toward their home, Richard glanced at Michael in the seat beside him. The boy was looking out the window, one hand still touching the golden locket that had changed everything. In that moment, Richard knew with absolute certainty that despite the wealth he'd accumulated, despite all his professional accomplishments, nothing would ever compare to the treasure he'd found in his son. That night, as Richard tucked Michael into his new bunk bed, the top bunk, of course, the boy asked to hear more stories about his mother. Richard sat on the edge of the bed, carefully choosing memories that would help Michael know the woman who had given him life. "Your mother was the most creative person I've ever known," he began, smiling at the recollection. "She could look at ordinary objects and see extraordinary possibilities. Once, when our car broke down in the middle of nowhere, instead of being upset, she turned it into an adventure. We had a picnic on the hood of the car and made up stories about the shapes we saw in the clouds. Michael listened intently, drinking in these details about the woman in the locket. She loved thunderstorms, Richard continued. While most people would hide inside, she would stand at the window, watching with this look of complete wonder on her face. She said the lightning was the sky taking photographs of the earth. Michael smiled at this, his hand automatically finding the locket around his neck. "Do I have anything else from her?" he asked hopefully. The question gave Richard an idea. "Wait here," he said, standing up from the bed. He returned a few minutes later carrying a dusty box that had been stored in the back of his closet for years, a box of Clara's things that he'd never been able to part with after she left. Together, they opened it to find photographs, letters, and small mementos of his life with Clara. There was the seashell she'd found on their honeymoon, ticket stubs from concerts they'd attended, and a small sketchbook filled with her drawings. Michael was fascinated by each item, particularly the drawings, running his fingers over the lines his mother had created. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small music box. "I completely forgot about this," Richard breathed, carefully unwrapping it. It was a delicate wooden box with hand-painted flowers that matched the design on the locket. When he opened it, a sweet melody began to play, the same French lullaby that Clara used to sing to Michael as a baby. The boy's eyes widened in recognition. "That's the song from my dreams," he whispered, confirming what Richard had suspected, that somewhere in his subconscious, Michael had carried memories of his mother all along. Richard placed the music box on Michael's nightstand, where its gentle melody could accompany him to sleep. "This was a gift I gave your mother when we found out she was pregnant with you," he explained. "She used to wind it up and put it next to your crib." Michael listened to the tune, his eyelids growing heavy despite his determination to stay awake and learn more about Clara. Richard gently pulled the covers up to his son's chin. "There are so many more stories I can tell you about her," he promised. "We have all the time in the world now." Michael nodded sleepily, the events of the day finally catching up with him. As Richard turned to leave, the boy's voice stopped him. "Dad, I'm glad you found me." The simple statement carried such profound meaning that Richard had to take a moment before he could respond. "I'm glad I found you too, Michael. More than you'll ever know." As he closed the door partway, leaving it open enough for the hallway light to provide comfort in the unfamiliar room, Richard heard the music box still playing its sweet lullaby, a maternal embrace rendered in melody, connecting past to present, mother to son, and healing wounds that time alone could never have mended. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, overwhelmed by gratitude for this second chance, for the golden locket that had guided his son home, and for Clara, whose final gift had been the possibility of reunion, of family restored against all odds. In the quiet of the evening, Richard sat in his living room, the city lights twinkling beyond the large windows. Just weeks ago, he had been a successful but lonely man, his achievements hollow without someone to share them with. Now, down the hall, his son slept in a bedroom filled with toys and books and possibility. The golden locket had transformed both their lives, turning strangers into family through a connection that had never truly been broken, only temporarily lost. Richard thought about the remarkable resilience of his son, who had endured so much yet maintained an openness to hope and joy. He thought about Clara, whose final act of love had been to leave a breadcrumb trail that might one day lead their son home. And he thought about the infinite ways life could surprise you, bringing unexpected gifts at the moment you least expected them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, helping Michael adjust to school, learning how to be a parent after years of believing that chance had passed him by, building a relationship based on more than shared DNA. But for tonight, Richard was content to know that the most precious thing he'd ever lost had been found again, all because of a chance encounter and a small golden locket containing memories of love that had never truly faded. As he gazed out at the city below, Richard made a silent vow to cherish each day with his son, to build a future worthy of Clara's memory, and to never again take for granted the true riches of life, family, love, and the miraculous connections that sometimes survive against all odds. Have you found happiness in unexpected places? Has an object from your past ever reconnected you with someone important? This story reminds us that sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't the ones we can buy, but the connections we make and the love we share. The locket wasn't valuable because it was made of gold, it was priceless because of the memories it held and the people it brought together. In our own lives, we may discover that the things we cherish most are not our possessions but our relationships, the bonds that sustain us through life's challenges and bring meaning to our existence. What might have happened if Richard had been too busy to notice the boy on the street that day? How many opportunities for connection do we miss in our hurried lives? Perhaps this story is a reminder to slow down, to notice the people around us, and to remain open to the possibility that fate might have extraordinary plans we could never anticipate. Like Richard, we might find that our greatest blessings come disguised as chance encounters, unexpected detours from our carefully planned routines. The millionaire found his true fortune not in his business success but in rediscovering the son he thought he'd lost forever, a priceless gift that no amount of money could buy. Remember that sometimes the things we think we've lost forever are just waiting to be found again. Whether it's a relationship, a dream, or a part of yourself that seemed forgotten, life has a way of bringing back what truly matters when the time is right. Like Richard and Michael, we may discover that what seems like an ending can actually be a new beginning, and that healing can come from the most unexpected circumstances. Their story reminds us that even after years of separation and heartache, connection is possible, redemption is possible, and love can find a way to bridge the gaps that life creates between us. What meaningful object connects you to your past? Is there someone you've lost touch with who might be waiting for reconnection? Take a moment today to reach out, to remember, to open yourself to the possibility of miraculous reunions in your own life. Share your stories of unexpected connections in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that remind us of the power of love, memory, and the unbreakable bonds that connect us even across time and distance. Together, let's celebrate the small miracles that happen every day, the chance meetings, the discovered treasures, and the precious moments of reconnection that make life's journey so extraordinarily beautiful.